And she was also an alum. She's part of this group at one point or the other. And she just finished a large-scale COVID study that had to do with tracing, link tracing data, and been involved in a lot of other network data collection process. I've been involved with adolescent data and other sorts of data around the world into collections. So we're going to just really open the floor, raise a few questions about turning on our mic so that Will doesn't get mad at me. There we go. And a few questions about the ways in which we do this. Just for the quick show of hands, who are involved in primary data collection right now? Or either have something happening in the process? How many people are using sensitive data, data that's identified at all? Great. Other people have no idea what they're doing yet. They're just going to open all these, starting this process. All right, I got a little bit of going on here. Okay, great. And so I guess, I don't know how you want to start this. There are two basic problems, maybe three, with network data collection that are somewhat unique to data collection in general. I'm assuming that all of you are basically familiar with protection of human subjects. That the overall goal and principle is that we get to get our information and do the work we need to do for the betterment of the world. And the last thing we need to do is hurt anybody in the process, right? And so respect for subjects, making sure that we do no harm, and doing the best we can to, the work that we're doing is making the world a better place as sort of the guiding principles of what we do. For network analysis, right, that's a little bit complicated because we first have to get identifiers for global network analysis. We have to figure out the names of the people that we're interacting with so that we can find them again, so that we can link them across that adjacency matrix. So it doesn't matter to me so much that I know that you have one friend. I need to know that friend's name so that I can then interview them and link them together, put these linkages together. So the basics, sort of non-independence of network data analysis requires us to have a non-anonymous surveys. We have to, our survey data collection almost always has to be confidential but not anonymous. Right? The second feature is the assumption of the boundary specification assumption usually is that we have the full population, or at least a good chunk of the population, for like everyone in a school, everyone in a community, everyone in an organization, which means that it raises this question which is known as deductive disclosure. And so deductive disclosure is the idea that even if I don't know your name, I know enough about you from the survey data collection and that you took the survey that I can figure out who you are. In the ad health case, like when we were first designing that study and thinking through it, we'd play little games like, how many Jewish basketball players are there in the school? Well, Jewish basketball players in 7th grade is one person. And once I know that person and I have their data, then I can figure out, well, every other question that they did on the survey. So highly clustered population surveys lead to this ability to determine who's in the case, even if you don't know their name. And the final issue, I think, at least the ones that come to top of my mind, data add to it if you want, is this idea of what's known as secondary consent. Is that especially when you're doing a snowball survey or doing some kind of a survey where you're going out and asking people to then ask other people, the people that you've asked in the survey have the opportunity to consent, but the people that they've named do not. And so those people are currently in your survey, but they're not consented to be in your study. And so figuring out how you deal with informed consent through this process of other expert informants is tricky, and we need to think about what that is. Dana, does that cover your...
It does, but I wanted to add something about the second point, which is that when you have relational data, as in a network, you might not have very identifying characteristics on a single person, but once you link them to someone else who might also not be very identifiable, that relation is what makes it easier to know who they are. So I'm a 46-year-old woman who lives in Chapel Hill. That's not very interesting. There are a lot of 8-year-old kids who live in Chapel Hill, but if you know that there's a 46-year-old woman who has an 8-year-old daughter, the set of people gets very small. So just by having that relationship, even if you have two people that might not be identified singly, once they're in a dyad, then it becomes easier to identify them.
So those are I think the big picture questions. And so now what the whole purpose of this is supposed to be a discussion. So what we hope to do is, and I think I see Michelle, was she in the back already? So I'm going to recruit you, Michelle, to answer questions. I thought Ashton was here, who's done a lot of responded to different surveys.
Stepped out, yeah.
John has also done a fair number of this kind of work in lab settings. And there are a bunch of others who are, Mark, I know you've done a lot of data collection already, so there's a handful of folks that have been around who've done data, so please jump in and help us answer these questions. But I wanted to open the floor to sort of, to hear what people have, what your concerns were, what your thoughts were. Otherwise, I will ramble, as my students, as Rima will be happy to tell you, we will do this a lot. So, Michelle, please.
I didn't hear, I apologize, I was like eating and out of what you were saying, but I didn't hear you necessarily mention a waiver of consent for secondary subjects.
I did not mention it, so.
So, when you have secondary subjects, these are individuals who you're reporting on in your social network study that, they're identified, you're reporting information about them. A lot of people I will request for IRB is a waiver of consent for those secondary subjects. The IRB sometimes will think of those individuals as those are subjects in your study, even though they are not like the person in front of you who is actually filling out your survey. They're people that person is talking about, they're secondary subjects. You don't have the ability to go get their consent because you can't just go ahead and reach out. This person, John Doe, said that they're your best friend and you confirm this information, you consent to this study. So for that reason, I usually ask IRB for a waiver of consent for those individuals, like saying, yes, they are subjects in the study, but it's impossible for us to consent them. And usually I've got approvals on those, and it sort of gets around concerns that IRB might have about whether not getting identifying information on individuals who are not in the study. It's just outright asking them, writing an opinion, I want a waiver of that consent. You also might do that if you're doing an online study sometimes, in regular non-network studies.
Great. Dana, did you have that same experience with Snowball?
No, I didn't. I did a respondent-driven sampling study early in the pandemic, and John has his hand up as well.
John, please.
I just want to confirm the last point about recently to get social media data, they're requiring the second of the population. So like, for instance, Facebook, when I use Facebook now, have to have that, it has to be ironclad. But frankly, they won't let you down. But so this is becoming a bigger issue across the whole wide domain of social network analysts, the studies, things like that.
One real take-home concern, like I think you wouldn't be in this room if you weren't trying to make the world a better place. So obviously we're out there trying to do good. Talk to your IRB. It's kind of like voting in Chicago, early and often, right? So make sure that you know the people on your IRB. Make sure they understand what you're doing. Make sure that that this isn't the first time they've ever heard of a social network analysis, right? And you want to make sure that like there's a huge community of people out here who've been doing this work for now decades. And I think the number of people who've been harmed from the social network survey is a grand whopping 0. So I think we're in really good shape in terms of the extent to which we've had any actual incidents. And so the key is to make sure that your IRB is fully aware of what's happening. Because their job is, they're doing their job. But if they don't know the field, which many of them don't, it's really hard for them, especially those that are engaged with the medical IRB. They're used to just a very different system of processes. And so it's useful to make sure that they understand what's there. So what do we do? Please, go ahead, question.
Research in academia has historically excluded minoritized and marginalized populations. Big issue that we face in this work is that we haven't done a good job of building trust. We've often broken that trust. My work is specifically with Latinx populations in the US, and one thing that I always promise my participants is anonymity and confidentiality, particularly as it relates to immigration status or different things like that. I'm really interested in social networks, but I'm really concerned about this ethical issue. I don't want to kind of undo the work that I've done in my research and my work to build that trust. So do you have any experience in how to protect anonymity as much as possible, knowing that it is somewhat difficult, and knowing that even if we haven't harmed anybody yet, we've historically not included these populations. So I don't know if we've faced a lot of these issues just yet, but this also pertains to things like gun violence or gang activity or things like that I'm interested in but concerned about. So what tips or experiences do you have about that?
Yeah, that's a great point. Is that an answer to that question, or?
Yes.
Yes, please. Deb.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, because my dissertation was in Brazilian immigrants in Massachusetts, and there's a large population that are undocumented. So I requested that IRB waive consent. So there was no paper trail between my participants and the research. So it was track code. So there was no definition of track code. I collected EagleNet. So I just assigned them to a code, and I collected for the authors just the first name. So it was like the Eagles were a code and the authors were the first name. So that's it.
That's an excellent point. And one of the key advantages of local network data collection over system level network, so egocentric data collection over sociocentric data collection, is that it can be done anonymously. So you can then ask people to say, just give me your first name and tell me the first name and initial, or whatever code that lets them remember the names of the people that they're arguing with or engaged with, and so you don't have to collect names. You don't have to have them at all. The other tip is that you might need the data you might need identifiers for data collection, but you probably don't need them for data analysis. And if that's the case, by all means, use it while you need it for the data collection, and then keep them in separate files and destroy them when you're done, because there's no need for you to have them. And if there's no need for you to have them, there's no need for anyone else to have them. The problem is, for sociocentric data, is you still have this deductive disclosure issue. So it's still possible that the data could be uncoverable if someone were to go in and try to figure out from the series of characteristics who these people are. And so it's your job to try to make sure as best you can that those data are stored in a secure way, that they're kept in a process that makes it possible, that it's difficult for non-trustworthy people to get it, and so forth. And so the key there, I think, and there's a lot of work that has to go into building trust with the community you're studying. And so the beauty of the data, for example, like John Potterett's data, is John Potterett worked for 20 years on the ground as a public health worker in Colorado Springs, and everybody there knew his name. He was out there on Saturday night, he was there working with those people, and so he had the chance to make sure that the community trusted him, and he was, he returned that trust at every moment he had. And I think that process of building those kinds of relations, that you can't do this work by just flying in, dropping in, hoping people about your survey and come back again.
And I would like to add to that too, because we did engage community participants during my COVID study. We weren't interested in whether or not they were documented or not, so we didn't ask. The survey was presented in Spanish or English. It was exactly the same. We worked with a community representative, and we also had something called a certificate of confidentiality, which means that you can't be compelled to share your data. So there's no way for someone from another agency or organization to use your study data to find people after the fact. And so that's what I would definitely recommend, is getting a COC.
Do you ever exclude nodes or links if it's too unique?
So in public health, you suppress anything that, depending on the data, there are either fewer than 5 or fewer than 10. And so if it's something that is smaller than that number, depending on the area and the data that you're using, you just don't report it. You either make the group bigger, or it's something that you just don't say.
I don't know who's first, please.
I'm curious about considering that you can kind of work backwards with sociometric networks, and there's a lot growing push towards data sharing. How do you balance reproducibility and these other aspects, which now every NIH grant has a data clearance capability?
Oh God.
You want to take this?
Yep. So yes, as of
The reason we're laughing is that we've been going around with a couple of papers on just this point. So this is exactly it, right?
Yeah, we're really trying to find a home for it. So yes, since 2023, if you have federal funding from NIH, you are required to share your data. None of the data sharing plans online are actually specific to network data, which has a unique structure, it has unique risks. And so that's a bit problematic, is when we're used to sharing data, to share network data in the same way, it really just doesn't work. You either lose the ability to replicate, or you risk the privacy potentially of some of your subjects. And so before that policy was in effect, Jim and I, Gabriel, Tom, John, all of us have been working on this NSF-funded platform for secure network data sharing. It should be ready for prime time by the end of the year. Can I say that? But it will be a repository that allows sharing of sensitive data. It also will have an interface to be able to analyze some of those data, and then there will be a way to share publicly available or less sensitive data as well. But what you're asking, I'm not actually answering your question, I'm plugging IdeaNet, which you'll hear about shortly, is that depending on the tools that you're using or the technique that you're using to share data, it either might not be protective enough for network data, or you might lose the ability to replicate. And so there are a couple of techniques that people typically use to share data. You can aggregate, you can reduce the data sensitivity of some fields, you can report part of the data. That doesn't really work for network data. And so depending on what technique you're using, it will have different implications for network data.
And so our main solution has been to say that you have to essentially store all the data in a secure, encrypted, fully fledged space. So you don't share data publicly, but the data is available by customizable DUA. So we create, the point is to create automated, simplified data use agreements that essentially require anybody who's going to have access to data to already have IRB approval from their home institution, that they're going to meet the requirements of the data, whoever deposited it, whoever their IRB requirements are, that those are met. And that if necessary, the strictest element is that the data can only be used within an analytic enclave. We're not providing the enclave currently, though there's a separate grant that's under the review to do that. But the solution is, we think it's a rock and a hard spot. So you either are replicable or you share. And our point is, well, you can only share under the conditions that are effectively the same conditions that the investigators had, which is to hold the data in a space that can't be made public. It's just not out here in space. And so that's been our solution. Now there are some folks, it's an interesting question. If you're dealing with something like census data or other data, there's a whole field of data masking that has to do with statistical reinterpretation of data. There's a theory that lets you get a lot of the moments of network data analysis without having nodes. So for example, if I give you what's known as the eigenspectrum of a network, I should be able to use that to get lots of information out of it without ever having any identifiable features. I could give you the coefficients from an exponential random graph model, and you could simulate data that looks a lot like the data that I have without actually being real. So there are other algorithmic solutions to sharing something like the data, but it wouldn't be exactly the data. Please. Yes, you.
I'm working on a project right now that's a network intervention, two different approaches to getting people to get breast cancer screening. And we're having this, it's not even really a problem, but the idea is leveraging community members to spread information within their own community. But there's a lot of misunderstanding of the intervention itself. Like people aren't quite, we do a survey after the intervention and people aren't quite getting all the information. But then we are encouraging them to spread the information. So I'm not sure how to negotiate that tension.
Yeah, boy, talk about a rock and a hard spot. My guess is that kudos to you for doing the right thing, which is the post-intervention survey, right? It would be so much worse if you did the intervention and have no idea what it does and it goes out in the world somewhere, right? So, but the fact that it's amen, right? So you're doing the right. So first point is, if you're going to do an intervention, monitor it so that you can see what effect it has. But once you have it, then the only sort of solution that I can think of is that you have to then modify the messaging, right? So you have to keep doing this. And this is why any of these kinds of processes, you hope to start small and move out and do the field work. Now I know your team, I know Melina's team, and so there's no way that those folks you haven't done the groundwork to get into it. But even then, it's going to have this kind of process. So it's just iterative, and all you can do is hope that the positive messaging swamps the negative messaging. Right? Please.
So following up, it's a longitudinal study. We're in 5 years, we're doing the intervention over 5 years. And I mean, I've been on it for a year, and the intervention itself is very different than it was a year ago. And I'm wondering if you do two different interventions, both are very different. And I don't know what the credibility looks like of the study 5 years later when we started collecting data. And over the course of 5 years, the actual interventions that we're comparing are so different.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's something you just have to describe to the, in the write-up and say, and I think that the beauty of that kind of model is that, if I were a reviewer and what I learned was that the team that did this intervention had modified it based on a follow-up of the respondents in order to make it more effective, I would see that as a positive effect, right? And then in the initial study, it's like, this is what you find based on the final intervention pieces as you've done them. And the next grant will be the one that takes the final one, right? That's why this is a process and not a work of art that's finished for one time at all. Please.
I guess I work for a center that does a lot of peer network interventions, and one of the ways that we've adjusted that process, I'm not sure what your intervention looks like, but typically if you're relying on peer network peers to facilitate and distribute information throughout a network, typically would be built in a period of time where you do practice role modeling sessions with the intervention team so that you practice the information that you're distributing, so that that information is more directed, and so you reduce some of that imperfect transformation as it gets distributed through the network, and that way you're able to build self-efficacy for the participants, and then also if you use that as a metric, it also reduces dropouts so that people are more likely to stay within the intervention rather than feeling like these people who participated in our study because on the post-survey intervention, you're like, well, none of the people you spoke to actually did the thing that we asked you to do, and then you label that as like a failure, then that person doesn't want to participate, continuing to be like a peer or mediating network. But if you measure it based on, okay, how many people have you talked to? Did you, these other more tangible metrics where success is easier, you get greater retention of people who want to act as a peer network, peer mentor moving forward. But also you reduce some of that messaging issues. At least that's what we found.
Are you paying it for the, I'm sorry, I don't even
Connect afterwards, and we'll have a whole session on intervention that Tom's going to run as well. Someone need it, please.
I just have some comments.
Please.
So I think there are two things here. One is the fidelity over time. So it's documenting fidelity over time is one thing. Another is documenting adaptations over time. So one thing is more of you want to stick to, and one thing to make a change with direction, right? And there are actually some data out there on how to document both of them. And check them to that will be helpful over the 5 years.
Please, sir.
I think a bit large population cohort longitudinal data collection for a while, and I think one ethical challenge is just like that I struggle with is you get into like, because the social world is so complex and then this relational data is so interesting, like as a researcher, this temptation of like, ooh, I could ask more invasive, and like it's just like the data, like, oh, there's some, it always raises some new question that's more invasive and more, like, there could be more, and then there's, as there are new techniques, it's just like, oh, I could do something with that data, and I could end up like sort of putting video cameras all over the village and kind of watching everyone, and you just start like this imaginary of like watching every part of every social interaction. And so that, I just feel like that's a challenge in and of itself, that like, that is true in non-network spaces, but I just noticed like being interested in relational things. Even as I ask questions like about negative aspects of relationships, I have to be like, is this appropriate to ask? Like, if you hate your neighbor? Like, that's just not something that I would ever answer myself.
Right. I mean, it's one of these. It's one of these things. I think that one thing to remember is that a survey is, a data collection event is an intervention, right? Anytime you do it's a social. It's a weird social thing to drop into somebody's house and spend 2 hours with them asking questions about their life, right? And so this kind of a process is something to think about in itself. But I really think that it's, so I think you're right. You should there are two kinds of trade-offs. One is that the most expensive thing we ever do is showing up at their front door. And once you're there, like you already invested that money, you want to get all of it you can as you're at it because you're not going to get a chance to come back again. So resisting that urge and asking only the questions you need to ask in order to answer the questions that you've posed and that you think are reasonably within the scope of your study is something, it's just a disciplining feature. But I think that shouldn't stop us from asking interesting questions. And so there are a number of folks now. We've had a study here that myself and Leanne was involved in where we literally put cameras in this very building watching undergraduates doing work with each other as part of a process. And we had the amount of work we had to go through just to store that data and make sure it's secure, and make sure it couldn't be identified from other people. And we've then, in the end, converted the videos to, to mask faces and things like this, are all part of the process of trying to figure out how can we make it as safe as we can without hurting, other people. And in these cases, these are undergraduates working on a pretty innocuous set of tasks, and it's probably the least revealing thing they've actually done. But we took it seriously. We wanted to do our best to make sure it was secure as we could. We have another a faculty in our department is literally has cameras set up on a playground or a preschool, looking at how kids share toys or not. And so it's a process of bullying and self-reflection to figure out that kind of process out. It's a great set of social psychological questions about the development of, about identity as kids become, really young kids to becoming middle school or middle-aged adolescents, or middle-aged children, excuse me. And so this process is something, sometimes the questions really are important. We really want to understand them, and that they're not going to ask questions about where they live. They're not going to ask questions about all the things outside that scope to try to help maintain a boundary on sort of this cross-knowledge. But this is part of the reason we're doing all this work for the archive, is to try to make sure that it's there.
But also it's a common ethical question in any data collection, right? I'm going to ask you about your sexual partners or your drug use or anything that you don't want to come out. So it's, part of your ethical duty to just say, is this really useful information? It's common across a lot of spaces. And Ashton is here too, I don't know.
Yeah, Ashton, I want to invite you to bump in as well. I know you've done a lot of work on RDS and these types of things that you'll talk about soon, but if there are other particular features of these items, don't be shy.
I guess it wasn't kind of minor, but it just came up with something I was working on today and yesterday. You might, there's all these techniques to sort of make it less risky. So you create data that are restricted versus not restricted. And one thing you might do is say, like, flag all personal identifiers. You have to be careful because we realized yesterday that one of our people putting in network data was actually putting the names of alters in like just a notes column in the data set that was like the publicly released data set that we were going to release. And that's like, potentially it didn't actually end up happening, but it could be a huge breach of kind of ethical things. So you have to be very careful on some of these training aspects because it wasn't something we thought might happen, but yeah.
I saw a hand over on this side and I've lost it. Please.
Do you think that the risk of confidentiality breach is like disproportionately greater for other people in the network? Like if I read a paper that I'm probably not going to make sense of who's a node and who's what and where. But if I'm in the sample and then I look at the results, like how do you sort of account for the fact that other people, especially if you're talking about something sensitive, maybe intimate partner violence in another community or something, how likely is it that other co-members of the sample who don't realize they're related in these ways figure that out, and what's the risk for harm to them? And you balance that in preparing to do the work.
I mean, I would say that that's theoretically possible. Is that what happened with Mario Small's graduate students? They recognize themselves, or?
I think so.
So there have been cases of re-identification, right? And so sometimes I believe you could absolutely recognize yourself. As far as then recognizing other people in the sample, I think in a small set that would be much, much, much easier in some of these small spaces or rare cases and things like that.
I think the key there is to make sure that when you report results, and it goes back to the point I made before, is that it's ask yourself if you really need to report the actual relation, or if you can, in the paper, you can do something like, instead of presenting the actual sociogram, predictive, cut off, a small piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
And the key is to make sure that what you're presenting is a plausible version of reality that helps you illustrate the point you need to make in the summaries of your data without being dishonest, without making it certain that that's the person that's doing this violence. So it's one thing to say that there's the interpersonal partner violence rate is 10% in this population, and it's more common if you have concurrent relationships in this part of the network than in that part of the network that is characterized by X, Y, and Z. And I can summarize that without having to show the actual sociogram,
right,
for example, and saying that, and then the advantage is that if I'm reading it as someone who could be, or even as someone in the community that sees a report, it probably rings true to people in the community about what the rates are and what the risks are. And if I'm a person whose reputation might be hurt by being engaged in this, I can recognize that this is true but it's nice also to see that it's not clear that that's me. Right? And there's another version of this that is probably less the case in this kind of a population than it is in some of the other work we do. But when you do consulting work in networks, people often want to see the sociogram, right? I want, if I'm hiring you to come into my company to figure out which are productive employees versus not, part of the issue is I want to see who's engaged, right? Who's engaged in stuff. And so you need to have a really upfront conversation with everybody before the data collection happens, so that they know when they, give you their data, that they might be, put up on a blue board here and say, like, here they are. And if everyone agrees, before they go into the process, that's one thing. But if people, especially if they don't have the opportunity to agree, then that's something else entirely. You need to be really careful with that. Please.
Yeah, we actually, well, we work with college students, and we actually show a subset of them their neural network sociograms, and we show it over time. I think actually the idea of like research as an intervention, like there's something really powerful about seeing your own network mapped out, and especially like between times, because it's longitudinal, there is tie trends. Sometimes that can get quite emotional for people because they could lose a tie because of death or some other reason that's sensitive. But I'm just wondering if anyone else has experiences of like sharing the data with the participants themselves, with the idea that like knowing something about their network might be useful.
Yeah. I mean, we've been thinking about the risks and the concerns, but the flip side is it can be really beneficial. So in lots of settings, to be able to show people what their world looks like, it makes the invisible visible, and that can be really sort of powerful and useful, and it can help them. A trivial example, I've done some consulting at a university I used to be involved with. I don't know if that's big enough, given that I haven't been involved in many universities. But where we took an English department and mapped the co-student networks. And it revealed a clear division in that department and only 2 people that linked between those 2 divisions. And it was really useful for that faculty meeting for them to sit down and say, well, what is this division? Right? How do we bridge it? What makes it useful? And so in that case, it was a very clear case of who the faculty members were. Everyone knew who they were, but it was nice for people to see that so that they could actually do something with that information. Now, co-mentoring of students is a pretty low bar for risk, and the benefit far outweighed the risk in that particular situation. But it made it obvious what needed to be fixed in that setting. And I think that knowing what your network looks like and what the different divisions are can really be illuminative. It can help people understand. So there's a lot of positive that can happen to it. The key is you don't want to do it without people knowing what they're getting into. And so that if someone wants to hide certain parts of their relation, that is their right, and we should make sure that we respect their right to hide information they don't want us to know about. We would like them to not hide relevant information, but if it's not relevant, we don't need to know it, and they have to have the right to control it. Other questions? Not, please.
I have another example, and also a related question, which was I did a project here in Orange County that was mapping human service providers networks, and one person told me about this group they had that was like, I don't know, providers of color or something. And all the other participants, it was a very small sample, got involved in that coalition through the results of the project, which was very cool. But on the other hand, this was a very small group of people providing services in Orange County, and it was really easy to figure out who the people were. And that was in my IRB application, that was in the disclosure that we gave to the participants, but even so in these interviews, these qualitative interviews, some of them are making really cavalier statements about funders, about other organizations, and it was fascinating, and I would have loved to include it, but ultimately my advisors were like, probably don't.
Right.
And they knew they were going to be identifiable. So I'm like wondering about where's that line? How do you decide that line?
It sounds to me like I would agree with your advisor. It's like, is it essential? Is it embarrassing? Is it, I think anytime you can come to a general conclusion without having to reveal information that could potentially be embarrassing, then do that. And just be clear that what you've done as an analyst, and that's our job. Like our job as analysts is to aggregate and synthesize information and do that. And by doing that, we've not only taken the data as best we can and done something reasonable with it, but we've also protected our respondents from saying stuff, even from the things that they might want to say. I mean, I'd be happy to dish on half my colleagues with you, but I'm not going to do it. I'd rather you think better of me and not report that information. All right. Other questions? I think one thing, so you're going to see a lot of data. The people who've collected network data, and many of us have used like ad health data, which, if you've tried to use ad health, it's a pain in the ass to get the contract and do the training and get on their server and all sorts of things. But they do that for a reason. It's because, they were given permission to get into, the intimate lives of students across the, and then follow them for now 25 years. And so that kind of data collection requires a certain amount of trust on the part of respondents, and it's going to take amount of work for us to use, and our job is to use it as responsibly as possible. And so I think that just keep that in mind as you move forward. Protect your communities and make sure you're doing the outreach necessary to get the right people in the community, the people that are relevant both for the questions you're being asked and for the service you want to provide to the community as a whole. And by virtue of doing that, I think we will not only promote this great way of doing work and do better version of it, but also, I think, I hope make the world a better and safer place by virtue of it. Questions, comments, thoughts, concerns? All right, I think the next in line is IdeaNet, right?
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay, if you have, if you're, maybe take us a quick minute while we switch things up. If you have dirty plates and such, find a home